Fascinated by James's dancing round smallism. He wasn't really smallest. The words fundamental and most real weren't actually attached only to subatomic particles, but you had the feeling that somewhere there was a slight, possibly smallest bias, and it raised the question of what are the most fundamental things in the world. And I think I probably misrepresented you. I can tell by the expression on your face I misrepresented you. But so that would be one question. You know, what do the physicists and the philosophers have to bring to the party in saying what are the most fundamental things in the world? The question of nature of space and time has come up, and I was quite amused to see in a way that Professor Craig felt that absolute time existed because God does, and God exists because absolute time does. That's not a fair summary of your argument. But, you know, what do the philosophers and the physicists have to bring to the party in terms of addressing the nature of time, whether it's absolute, relative, and so on and so forth? I think James mentioned Wilfred Sellars, and I quoted him earlier on, that the issue of connecting the manifest and the scientific image of the world, because we do want to bring these things together. As James and I both quoted Sellars, you know, we want to see how the world hangs together in the deepest and broadest sense. One other area perhaps that we wanted to address, none of these, you may want to reject all of these, was raised by Alastair Wilson when he was, again I felt possibly circularly, supporting a realistic interpretation of possibility, modal realism, because it was okay, it supported the Everista in their interpretation of quantum mechanics. You know, that seemed possibly a circular approach, and one would, I think there was a challenge from the audience to say, well, actually, almost by definition, the Everett approach is going to be immune from empirical testing because the multiple universes are actually quarantined from each other by definition. Anyway, these are some of the things, while these chaps are getting their thoughts and you're getting their thoughts, I thought I'd throw some stones in the pool. So who'd like to bite on anything that's been thrown in so far, or you might want to have a totally different agenda?
Can I say something about smallism?
Yes.
Look, I think that there's a genuine fact that we learn from the history of science. The research programs that gave chemistry, biology, strong kind of autonomy from physics failed. They might have worked, but they didn't. So in the 19th century, people thought, maybe there are a special kind of, well, in fact, it was a natural thing to think, given that you had the Newtonian force law for gravitation and then added a force law for electrostatics, you could have thought, okay, so that's now a method we can use in science. We've got some domain of phenomena, we'll posit a force. And that was a reasonable thing to do. And people thought there were special forces in tissues, special forces associated with the nervous system, and so on. And likewise, people thought that there was chemical forces to explain chemical bonding. And those research programs all failed, and it turned out that we were able to account for the phenomena without bringing new forces into physics. And so here's a kind of tentative empirical hypothesis, which might be false, but I think it's probably true, which is that it'll never be necessary to bring a new entity or process or kind of thing into fundamental physics solely to account for a phenomenon that's found in the special sciences. We'll always be able to, by cleverly thinking about how the physical things are interacting, to recover an understanding of the special science phenomenon. So if that's right, then I think we have to, in our philosophy and our metaphysics, we have to give some kind of priority to physics, because the history of science has taught us that it has some kind of priority.
Okay.
But it's not so much priority that we can say everything's really physical, or there's nothing except particles, or whatever. And we can't say that as well, because physics doesn't seem to have, so far, it hasn't found a fundamental level. And for all we know, there may not be one. It may just be structure all the way down, turtles all the way down.
Okay. What about anybody else in the team like to comment on that? That's never gone by the sound of it. Yes.
I mean, this is maybe not a provocative comment in the sense that I think that's basically right. Asymptotic freedom, though, and quark confinement, it's important not to get too literal or naive about the kind of small. And the sense in which a proton is made of 3 quarks is a real sense, but not the sense in which a house is made of 100,000 bricks or whatever.
Yeah. That's a paraphrase of something that we say in Everything Was Going. We say the sense in which things are made of atoms is not the sense in which walls are made of bricks. That's exactly what we say, so I definitely don't think that.
Yeah, so given that caveat, I think that's probably right.
But Professor Craig, I'm sure you would you have some dissent on this?
I think so. It seems to me that when you say things like this, that fundamental physics cannot invoke higher level entities, that is on the brink of just being analytically true, because otherwise it's not fundamental. You're appealing to higher levels. So it's not clear to me that that's making any sort of a non-trivial claim. The example that was given of a person willing to go on a walk and therefore the atom on his finger moves about would suggest that higher level entities can be causally relevant to explaining things, even if that's no longer than doing fundamental physics by definition. I think that the criterion for ontological commitment that you've expressed is one that strikes me as ad hoc. There's nothing about quantification logically that would say that things that are quantified over that have predictable laws are ontologically real, and the things that are not are therefore unreal. Usually the appeal to quantification theory is based upon the idea that the existential quantifier expresses the ordinary language sense of to exist. And so it's not really quantification that is giving you your commitments, it's this idea of predictability. But on that grounds, human beings don't exist. I don't think cats would exist because they certainly are not governed by predictable laws. And so I'm concerned that this criterion of ontological commitment is not only ad hoc, but would lead us to think that certain things don't exist that we have every reason to think they do exist.
I've been wondering everybody else then. I wonder, Hans, do you have a feeling of how we should use the word fundamental properly, and do you feel it's a reasonable question to ask what is the fundamental stuff of the world? And if you ask that as a reasonable question, would you be a smallist, or a medium-sizist, or an agnostic?
Yeah, I don't like the word fundamental just because it's used so often by metaphysicians. So I do understand the word of I can reduce one problem to another problem, or I have a description and I can embed that in a description that's of greater generality, or encompasses more different possibilities. So I'm happy to use those terms, and then in those terms I agree with what James said.
Mm-hmm.
I think that physics has proven over time to be the best strategy, the most general strategy. But then I'm not willing to draw ontological implications from that. So, like, I would, in agreement with what Professor Craig said, do human beings exist, even though maybe we can't predict, can't derive their existence from fundamental, quote unquote, fundamental physics? Well, I have no problem saying that.
But when I say there are laws or causal regularities, they're not required to be absolutely deterministic. I mean, we wouldn't talk about human beings if that didn't allow us to predict the phenomena. We could predict all sorts of phenomena. Human beings are pretty predictable. I mean, in lots of ways. They're not. Individuals are maybe not, but and that folk psychology is just a proto kind of theory that embodies, quantifies over certain things, people, and other things, beliefs, desires, in order to do a reasonable job of allowing us to track the phenomena, which is where are these, things in my digital field, these bodies going to be later on, right? They're not here because there's nowhere to sleep and there's no food or drink. And that's a prediction. It's based on quantifying over people.
Alastair, were you just signalling to say something? No.
I agree with that last point, James. I just wanted to ask.
He said, can people hear? I'm sorry, the microphone should be whizzing between them. Can everybody hear? Are you okay at the back?
Yes. Yeah.
Thumbs up, so you can hear. Fine, but do project the voice, gentlemen.
Sure. So I wanted to ask James whether he extend this primacy of physics, this asymmetry between physics and the other sciences, to apply between individual higher-level special sciences. So you might think, for example, that we're never going to need to appeal to biology to give explanations in chemistry. And if we did, it would be like the case of the rhinoceros horn.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this is why I think that this kind of metaphysics is not just done by philosophers. So Paul Nurse at President of the Royal Society gave a talk in Bristol. He said 5 great ideas in biology. And one of them was that biological processes are really chemical stroke physical processes. And biologists think, on the whole, they sort of learned that from Pasteur, that they came to see that they could understand what were thought to be sui generis biological processes as chemical processes. And because of that, you have biochemistry. And if you completely deny the kind of asymmetry I'm talking about, it just becomes utterly mysterious why A, it's been so successful to have biochemistry, molecular biology, and so on, and B, why the scientists seem to think it's an important part of their worldview that we've learned something like some kind of physicalism, and that they advertise that as one of the lessons of the development of science. And I think we get into trouble if we go too far and adopt a strong form of reductionism. But we can't go completely the other way and have a kind of disunity.
Okay, fine, yes.
Although this seems less obvious if one goes slightly higher up the tree. I mean, I can see biology, chemistry, physics, but take psychology, sociology, and economics. I can easily imagine giving economic explanations for psychological happenings, and I also imagine giving psychological explanations for economic happenings. Now, does that mean that really I have to consider all these as one theory? Or should I say something else about them?
I think that's really interesting. I mean, there is a program to unify the behavioural sciences with evolutionary game theory. And insofar as one thinks that the economics, whether it's using economic explanations or often using evolutionary game theory stories to explain things about how mating strategies. So I just think that's an open question. I mean, I think it's a very, very good question.
I don't do too self-advertising, but if you want to see a total destruction of evolutionary psychology, and in particular its neuroeconomics and game theory, you could read a book called Aping Mankind by Raymond Tallis. I'll put that in brackets. Well, look, I think we've looked at, as it were, some ontological questions. One of the questions, and the question of whether there's a privileged level at which you determine what is the stuff of the world. What other questions are burning in the panel's mind in like a focus
I
on
have
the
a
next 10
question for
minutes?
Hans. In your talk, you alluded in passing to non-collapse, but non-Everettian theories or interpretations of quantum mechanics, and you had reference to Bohm's quantum mechanics, and just said in passing that this faced challenges from relativity theory, and I was wondering whether we shouldn't give that more serious play. It seems to me that it's much more plausible than the many worlds interpretation, and that it gets rid of all this collapsing. We don't have to worry about that. We just have a kind of invariables theory that's non-local. What about taking that approach?
First of all, if you put a lot of weight on common sense, in a certain sense of the word common sense, I think Bohmian mechanics looks very attractive in the sense of it looks very classical. It looks very much, in a lot of ways, like physics from Newton and so on. So then if you can also bracket any worries about relativity, which clearly you've bracketed, so if you're not worried about being compatible with special relativity, if you think in fact special relativity at the fundamental level is false, then Bohmian mechanics has a lot to recommend it. I have even further, I should say, sort of aesthetic objections to Bohmian mechanics. So I think of these things, I try to think of these things sometimes from the point of view of mathematical physics and not just say metaphysics. So my only desideratum, it's not that my single desideratum is, let's give a picture that's most likely to be true. There's another desideratum, let's give a picture that's also fruitful. So let's give a picture that's going to lead to good physics in the future, and not just right now. And I think Bohmian mechanics fails that test. Because Bohmian mechanics, it looks like a sort of dead end. It could be a complete theory, that's it, that's the end of the story. But it doesn't tie in well with other developments, not only in physics, but I would say actually also with mathematics. So the mathematics involved in Bohmian mechanics is basically elementary differential equations, the kind of stuff you could have learned in 1910 if you were studying physics. It's not engaging with any of the sort of intellectual developments that have happened in mathematics itself. So this, for me, actually is a bit of a flaw, because I see in the history of physics a very fruitful interplay between developments in mathematics and development in physics. And I don't see this happening with Bohmian mechanics. So that's a sort of a side thing that I can't put in a very tight philosophical thesis, but it just strikes me as not going in the right direction. Not going in the direction, say, if you think of, Newtonian physics came along with the development of calculus, a beautiful combined interaction of mathematics and physics. Same happened in early quantum mechanics. Early quantum mechanics, we have this new theory, we have this development of matrix mechanics, Hilbert space, a beautiful marriage of mathematics and physics. Bohmian mechanics seems like a regression, saying, forget all the new mathematics we learned, let's pretend like it's the 19th century again. So this just strikes me as something that's not quite right.
I think, Alastair, you want to make a point, and then Professor Hooley.
So of course we want new physics down the line, hopefully quite soon. It just seems odd to me to think that the place to look for it is going to be in these very general considerations about quantum mechanics. There's still so much about the fundamental interactions that we don't understand, and there's so much new physics there. That's why look back at quantum mechanics, the basic algorithms of which seem to work extremely well without any extra. Can I make an analogy? If at the end of the 19th century, classical physics had continued to pass all the experimental tests, we would have still developed the various kinds of, say, kind of Riemannian manifold theory suitable for general relativity, but if classical mechanics had continued to pass the experimental tests, we wouldn't have needed to change it, and there it wouldn't have, classical mechanics wouldn't have been producing any new, it wouldn't be using the new math, but that wouldn't be a blow against it as long as it was still saving the phenomenon.
Well, not in and of itself. Actually, I suspect the following would have happened. Had we lived in a possible world where classical physics is true, not the world we live in.
Not that there are any such possible worlds.
Okay, live in an impossible world where classical physics is true. I think what would happen is we would have a much more sophisticated apparatus to do classical physics. So already, of course, we know that what happened in the 19th century was instead of just using, r to the 2n and differential calculus on r to the n, what did they do? They actually started doing classical mechanics on Riemannian manifolds, right, Lagrangian mechanics. And then they used even different kinds of manifolds. They used symplectic manifolds and did Hamiltonian mechanics. So always, even in the classical worldview, there was conceptual innovation occurring with the mathematics in tandem with the physics. And I mean, this is a non-trivial thesis, but I think the idea of what a classical mechanical system is changed with the mathematics. So I think that as Newton understood it is not the same as Hamilton understood it. It's not as radical as one quantum mechanics, but...
Well, there's much more to be, I'm sure, the panel want to say to each other, but I think we should throw it over to the people. And these are your topics, ladies and gentlemen. And I will... Josh? Yes, the lady in front. And actually, I suppose you might need a microphone, or I can repeat the question. Let's see how it goes. You give your question. Yeah.
Would it be possible for you to explore the possibility that Orthodox Christian theology, and I know I'm throwing in a slightly different approach here, has long posited the possibility of parallel universes that both intersect and then digress at different points, using the language of angelic beings, of revelation, which suggests very real but separate universes.
So just to repeat the question, is it possible, as it were, this one could be...
Comment on that.
Sorry?
I was just interested in a comment from the...
Yes, so I know Professor Craig is the obvious comment.
Sorry, no, I'd rather...
That within theology, which has parallel universes containing angels and other items, that this may somehow be reflected in physics or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that what you're talking about are different realms of the same created order. Namely, there could be physical realms and spiritual realms inhabited by minds without bodies. So that you were talking in your talk about the reality of minds in addition to physical objects. There could be unembodied minds. I think that's what you're speaking of, but you're not really talking about parallel or other universes, which, as Alastair said, are causally unconnected with each other, unless you have this sort of splitting that is envisaged in the usual many worlds hypothesis. So I don't think that that is what one is speaking of in talking about a hierarchy of beings, from material beings to embodied minds to unembodied minds to God, who is an unembodied mind that is infinite in its capacities.
Or we say, nice try. Yeah, so sort of so next question. Yes, in front and then gentleman over, fire away.
Just basically, do you think we should abandon the concept of the particle altogether and just work it as fields?
Should we abandon the concept of the particle altogether? Wow, who's going to feel that one? James,
James, are you ready to agree with me? Yes.
Sorry?
Are you ready to agree with me?
Should we
As a
abandon
fundamental.
Yeah, but we won't abandon the concept of particle because it's useful, and we'll always want to give an approximate description in terms of particles for the where we do now. But yeah, I guess that's already happened. I mean, a good example. I mean, people are saying we've discovered the Higgs boson, right? The definite article is not appropriate. Even in the standard version of the Higgs story, that's just the first excitation of the Higgs field. Secondly, my understanding is you look up the Higgs boson, it says spin 0, no charge, no color charge, just mass. But the Higgs field is not a spinless field, right? And so it was already the case, and you can't possibly think that the story is really one about the Higgs particle. It's obviously a story about the Higgs mechanism and the Higgs field. So I think it's already happened.
Hooley, you wanted to respond as well.
Yeah, I disagree. So there's a sense of particle which is naive and which is tied to position measurements, and why should position measurements be special? Fine. I'm happy to give particles up in that sense. But there's also a sense of particle which is associated with the properties of the field that are quantized, which exists because the Planck constant exists. You know, the fundamental bosonic commutation relations have a 1 on the right-hand side. That's a particle. Right? So without doing any measurement which naively would measure the position of a particle or anything that seems obviously particulate, I can still notice that if I take a quantum dot and I start changing the gate voltage on it, electrons go in one by one. And I can see signatures of the electrons going in one by one through a narrow constriction. I didn't put anything in that system to force it to behave that way. Indeed, from the field ontology, it would be a lot more natural if the electric charge just bled onto the quantum dot continuously. But it doesn't. And that is particulate behavior. And it's particulate behavior that you would find empirically, even if you came at the problem with a theory that was constructed entirely of fields.
Hans, do you want to?
I think that what you two just said is completely consistent, though, because, right, so in other words, you're saying there's particle-like behavior, and James would say, yes, a real pattern. So it's the same, different words for the same thing. And you both agree that, at the quote-unquote fundamental level, it's really under there's a quantum field.
So the particle isn't dead yet, but it isn't alive either. That's what we seem to get, like Schrodinger's cat. But, so any further responses on particles, or shall I?
I was going to say this case beautifully illustrates that when physicists often say that there's no place for philosophy, and then you can that great case because then you find Steve Weingart says quantum field theory is a theory about particles, and then Robert Wald says, now one thing you have to know about quantum field theory is it's not about particles. Proves that there is still something to be discussed here.
So you think the philosopher can act as a referee in that kind of debate? So I think that's a really interesting point.
I don't think the philosopher should be a referee. I just think there is an issue left to discuss.
Perhaps to ask them to clarify their terms and their debate, that sort of thing. And
Yeah, I would say when you mean particles, what criteria are you putting down?
Yeah.
And when you say there's none, what are your reasons for saying there are none? And actually philosophers have done some of this stuff. I mean, there are actually no-go proofs in the literature that say, if by particle you mean 1, 2, 3, well, I can prove that in your theory there are no particles. But if by particles you just mean 1, 2, well, yeah, you have those sorts of things. So it's been worked on, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think you just need to shout, and I'll repeat
Sure.
the question. Yeah.
My question is to James Ladyman. I was wondering about your concept of scale. You were talking about how there were appropriate laws for different scales. You get to larger scales and you get to sociology, but then eventually you get to planets, and then you get to galaxies, and then you get to conditions that were actually determined on a very, very small scale. You get to cosmology. And cosmology was determined by the initial conditions of the Big Bang, which are on a very small scale. How does all of this work together with the concept of fundamental physics? Would I expect different physics on such a large level, or would I expect it just to break down to fundamental physics because it used to be so very small?
Yeah, but it's really difficult. So first thing I want to say is I don't think by scale I necessarily mean length scale, but perhaps it might mean energy scale in many contexts. But often it does mean length scale for lots of things we're talking about. I don't know enough about cosmology, and it may all, I mean, everything I said may just fall apart, because I understand that some people think that, and here it's very, very sketchy, that symmetry breaking in the early universe may be dependent on temperature. And if that's right, if temperature is a macroscopic kind of, it's a high level emergent property, and yet it plays a role in determining the way symmetry breaking occurs, then that might mess up my story. Like I said, wrote the book telling philosophers to pay attention to science, trying to get from baby quantum physics and general relativity to proper quantum physics and quantum field theory, and really like to understand cosmology, and I don't, and so I guess it's a real hostage to fortune for my position there, what we end up ultimately thinking about these questions.
So can I ask the physicist, does it mess up his theory? Does it mess up his philosophy of science?
I don't think it does, actually, as long as you make one relatively small modification and say that it's not about size, and it's not necessarily about energy either. It's about the number of accessible soft degrees of freedom in the system. And this is what a condensed matter physicist, I think, would say. I mean, there has been a branch of the more philosophical end of condensed matter literature talking about these things for a few decades as well. Phil Anderson had a famous paper called More is Different. And the point there is it's really about, if I hit this system with something, where can that energy go? And in that sense, at the scales of force and distance that we're talking about, you do recover something that looks more like particle physics on the cosmological scale, because you tend to be following the center of mass of pretty rigid objects subjected to pretty weak forces, or you're following individual objects that make up a cloud. So you've reverted to a condition of what we would call, I suppose, low temperature entropy, which looks more like particle physics and less like biology. I think as long as you're happy to adopt a yardstick of that sort, I think it still hangs together.
I guess I just worry about thermodynamics and not understanding it, and how it seems, the fact that it applies so readily to black holes and sometimes applies to the universe itself as a whole, it sort of seems like it has a funny status. It seems like it ought to be an emergent bit of physics, but it often seems to be playing a role as if it was fundamental.
Thank you.
Wouldn't not only temperature, but also things like space-time curvature and density also be problematic for your thesis that in fundamental physics you don't have higher level explanatory entities? It would seem not just temperature, but these other factors too might be problematic in the early universe.
Well,
You can take legal advice later on.
they are different though, because curvature is local. So you can, in principle, sit at a point in space-time and exploring only a tiny infinitesimal neighbourhood of where you are, you can determine the curvature. Whereas temperature is intrinsically coarse ground. So I agree that temperature is relevantly different from these other things. I mean, you do have curvature on the large scale, but it's just made up of lots of little curvatures on small scales. Whereas the temperature on the large scale is not made up of a lot of little temperatures on small scales, rather it emerges as a definable thing as the system considered gets larger, which is a more subtle relation.
Yeah. Catherine, I think that's what
Yeah, I had a question arising from Hans's talk this morning about the contrast between ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism. And as I understood it, ontological naturalism was the kind of view or the stance, involved a view about what there is, right? There aren't any supernatural things. How do we conceive of that? Whereas I thought the methodological naturalism was a very interesting suggestion, the thought that we should set our views about what that ultimately is, or our metaphysical views perhaps on one side whilst doing science or whilst doing physics. And the example you had on the slide said, well, so we don't need to talk about whether there's God or whether there are Cartesian egos whilst we're doing science. But there was also an etc. there. I think it was kind of God, souls, and etc., etc. And one of the things I find difficult in this area is the question of, well, which are the things that go in the etc., right? So traditionally, metaphysics has studied things like time and substance and space that we might, of course, now think science has a lot to tell us about. I mean, do you think the methodological naturalist will have to sort of take a view about, is there going to be an in-principle way of saying what we can leave on one side when we go into the lab and what we have to bring with us?
Could we have a definition of both methodological and ontological naturalism as part of your answer to the question?
Okay, so here's what I'll do, is I won't try to define naturalism, but I'll try to tell you the difference between those two versions of naturalism. So of course, ontological, so the problem is, no one knows what it means to be a naturalist, really, except you can say things like, well, it means believing what scientists tell you to believe, or it means doing what scientists do, or approving of what they do. But older-fashioned definitions, like, for example, Descartes' definition, the physical is the extended stuff, no one believes that anymore because physics doesn't fit with that. So physics is clearly telling us about natural stuff. Physics is not just telling us about extended stuff in space, so therefore that won't work. And you can try 1,000 other definitions of the same sort. None of them work to demarcate the natural from the non-natural. So I don't know what that means. But ontological naturalism, I can give you ostensive definition, right? Who's an ontological naturalist? Daniel Dennett, for example, right? David Wallace. You can go down the list, people who say, that can't exist because it's not natural. They can't tell you what natural is. They certainly can't tell you what things aren't natural, or what sorts of things aren't natural. A methodological naturalist would be, so I jokingly said, or sort of slipped in my talk, there's the sort of the bad version. That's the version of the person who says, I may believe in some stuff that's not considered to be natural stuff, not considered to be physical stuff, but I don't want to get in trouble. I want to get tenure, and so I'm never going to mention it when I'm doing my work. That's one version of methodological naturalism. And then there's a more sophisticated version, which, to be honest, I have yet to hear anyone give a really clear account of a principled version of this, but the idea that something about the practice of science in general, or certain sciences, rules out certain considerations. The best thing I've heard, and I'll just credit this to a colleague of mine who's not known for doing metaphysics, he's a philosopher of mathematics named John Burgess, and he has some views about this that I've asked him walking down past the halls, and he says, and it's very similar to the quote we heard from Russell, and that is, Burgess says, the natural, the scientific, is what can be put into a mathematical formalism, what can be modeled by mathematics. So that actually would be a dynamic thing that's changing over time as we're become more sophisticated. So for example, we might have thought time, 200 years ago, we might have thought of time as something that lives in the realm of metaphysics, and physics has nothing to say about, because it was just sort of a fixed background thing. We might think then that Einstein, what he did essentially on his good days, is he actually brought it into science, something we actually could treat scientifically. So then it would become permissible to talk about that in a scientific context. I don't have anything better to say beyond that, except that, of course, there are historical examples of people who put forward such positions, like famously Pierre Duhem. Duhem was known for saying, I can keep my metaphysics at home, and then I can do my history of science, my physics, and never bring that stuff on board. I'm not a Duhem scholar. I don't know to what extent what he said was coherent. He certainly was attacked for what he said, but he had a lot to say in response to it as well.
James might have something to say about Duhem, but Catherine, did you want to come back to that satisfy you? Did you want any further?
It was very interesting, yes. The Burgess criterion, I said if you can mathematise it, then it's something that you can handle. Oh, you see, the worlds that Alastair was talking about, in a way, they're the kind of verification of mathematical structure. So, I mean, I take it then a methodological naturalist wouldn't rule them out of hand. There'd be something they would consider, is that the way we want to go or not? The mere fact that they're kind of metaphysical in some sense doesn't mean that they're...
Yes, I think this would be a fairly liberal, I mean, the way I'm thinking of it would be fairly liberal, so that what a lot of analytic metaphysicians are doing would be considered, in a way, scientific, because of how rigorously they do it. Actually, I think it was not wrong for... So, of course, we all think back to Quine, right? And Quine is the one... In one way, Quine, who's an enemy of metaphysics in one sense, also enabled a lot of current analytic metaphysics by saying what? By saying philosophy is continuous with science. And that enabled a bunch of philosophers to go, yay, I'm doing science. And so David Lewis is the striking example of this, right? He's Quine's student who goes on and does very speculative big metaphysics. But notice how rigorous... He is operating very much with a style like theoretical physics. And now he probably got away from physics in some way, and of course his descendants, as James would argue, have gotten very much too far away in certain senses. But I think there's pieces of it that look very hard to distinguish from normal theoretical science.
So that'll warm the cockles to your heart. You wanted to say something. Yeah.
So as an account of naturalism, that Burgess seems appealing. One way of modifying it, though, what's natural doesn't change over time, would just be to make it a case of what can in principle be mathematized, even if we don't currently have the technique to do it right now. And just another thing, I think it's absolutely right that David Lewis would have thought of his project as a naturalist project. I think he would have welcomed the term natural. Wouldn't necessarily have called it science, because I think he would have thought, well, maybe he would have thought scientific is a perfectly acceptable term for it. He wouldn't necessarily have called it science, but that just because he didn't think science doesn't have a monopoly on studying the natural world, and that actually metaphysics, if it's done rigorously enough and linked up enough with science, it can make a very generous contribution as well.
I mean, Husserl had this great fantasy, of course, of a scientific metaphysics, and at the end of his life, of course, he felt the dream was over. But I want to make a philosophy as a science. Yes, the gentleman there in the blue t-shirt, yes.
This might be a little bit might be a little bit too close to shut up and calculate, but we do struggle to intuitively understand, say, what goes on in black holes and so on. Is it actually necessary to disentangle the observer and the measurement problem? Can the cat actually be just alive and dead, except we just learn to live with it?
So, did anybody catch that question? Do you want to, sorry, you could just speak a bit louder. It's a good question, I thought, but I couldn't quite hear it.
Maybe a bit too close to shut up and calculate, but do we actually have to resolve the measurement problem? Can we just learn to say that the cat is both alive and dead?
Do we have to resolve the measurement problem? Can't we just live with the fact that the cat is both alive and dead? Wow, yes.
I wonder if I can ask one of someone in our audience to answer this. There's a greater expert, Guido, actually Galuppi right here, has worked on this question. And so, is it permissible?
Of course it is. Do stand up. Stand up and... Oh, thank you for that.
Actually, it seems to me you were addressing this question this morning.
Would you mind standing up so people at the back can hear you? Sorry.
Actually, I think Hans was addressing this question this morning about the various possible stances one can take to the measurement problem. Some of the bits that you skipped, these are some possible stances, and to a large extent, I think the history of the development of quantum theory has been of that sort. We have bracketed the measurement problem to a large extent in order to get on with other things. And if you want to think of this purely from the philosopher's point of view, is this now conceptually satisfying and so on and so forth, then especially the kind of naturalist set of mind in the philosophy of physics, then of course a measurement problem or understanding quantum mechanics more generally, entanglement, ubiquitous entanglement and so on, is a very high priority. Purely from the scientific, from the physical point of view, that depends on how much new physics you expect to come out of attempts to tackle the measurement problem. Say, if you think that the Schrödinger equation might actually break down, and that's what we really need to do in order to understand what's happening in measurement. Okay, Schrödinger equation breaking down. Goodness, I mean, that is new physics. There will be sort of new phenomena that we haven't observed yet. Even more so in the bone theory. The bone theory at rock bottom is a dynamical theory of configurations, whatever they are, field configurations, particle configurations, whose dynamics is defined through the wave function or whatever, and quantum effects are recovered in equilibrium if the configurations are distributed to the Born rule, and there are results about relaxation times and so on and so forth. So you do expect a lot of disequilibrium effects, violations of the Born rule, signaling faster than light, and so on, in appropriate circumstances which are difficult to find. If you think that's a promising avenue for new physics, then you should definitely not bracket the measurement problem.
But Hans, I think you would still feel it's an important problem, even if it didn't generate new physics, because it generates new metaphysics for you. It, as it were, makes dualism respectable.
The measurement problem.
Yes, and resolving the measurement, a resolution of the measurement problem, or offering the resolution that you
honestly, I would rather it have been the case that, say, Bohmian mechanics all worked out and was nice and beautiful, because look, quantum mechanics is still a puzzle. I mean, so the measurement problem, I think it's just not as bad a problem as some people have made it out to be. I think it's a puzzle. I think it's something that ought to be worked on, ought to be thought about. In fact, I was telling Guido, who is a good friend of my doctoral advisor, and so my doctoral advisor unfortunately passed away in 2002, so Guido's like a guiding spirit. And I was telling him this morning over coffee that I had been feeling comfortable for a while with the measurement problem, but I woke up this morning and unfortunately was taken by this attack, and I really don't understand what's going on here. I think that's the case. I don't think it's helpful to dualism per se. I don't think we look at the measurement problem and go, yay, that supports dualism. I do think it's less urgent a problem for someone who has dualist inclinations. I think it's an absolute crisis for someone who feels they need to give a proof that ontological naturalism can be carried through in all domains of life. Yeah. That we can reduce consciousness right now to physics. Yeah. Then it's a problem.
I'd like to I just wanted to interject a suggestion in answer to this question, which is that the question might actually have two parts, one of which is more properly philosophical and one of which is more properly physical. This chap with his cat has a lot to answer for, actually, because it gives you this idea that we have classical things and quantum things, whereas in reality, and there are decades of experiments showing this, the crossover between quantum mechanical and classical behavior is totally continuous. I can do electron interference experiments around little copper rings and I get a nice interference pattern like the two-slit pattern, and I make the ring a bit bigger, and the interference pattern gets a little bit less visible, and I make the ring a bit bigger, and it gets a little bit less visible, and it slowly fades to black, back into classical behavior. Now, obviously, the study of this phenomenon, A, has nothing to do with dualism, and B, is the kind of thing a physicist ought to be thinking about, and the development of the theory of decoherence, quantum mechanics of open systems, has been partly driven by a desire to understand these things. Now, you still have a problem at the end of that. The measurement problem doesn't go away, because although you've reduced all the probabilities to something that's very close to 1 and something that's very close to 0, they are still probabilities. But I think that vestigial philosophical problem might very well be one that we could come to ignore. If we cleaned up everything else, I think that question of the probabilities being nearly 1 rather than exactly 1 might go away, as the question about what it is that makes objects obey Newton's first law has gone away. Newton spent a lot of time worrying about that, but now we don't.
We've got a very quick response, but I wanted to fit in one further question. So you were going to say, you were to...
Well, I wanted to press Hans a little bit on what exactly your physical interpretation is then in the measurement situation. Your objection to Bohmian mechanics is principally aesthetic.
That's a big question.
Right, it's principally aesthetic, but are you or you not then postulating that there are immaterial selves, immaterial minds that collapse the wave function in any measurement situation?
So I would like to think that I can coherently right now withhold belief on a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I think the best option, so look, there's a multifaceted sort of answer, and this really does get down to pragmatic stuff. In one sense, actually, my entire attitude to the measurement problem arose out of a need to defend myself professionally against people who thought the only important question to work on is the measurement problem. And so I thought, okay, for a long time I just ignored their voices, and I thought I'm going to work on my things. I'm going to ignore this because actually what my advisors told me to do. They said, there's other things to think about, work on these other things. And then finally got to the point where I had to give some sort of apologetic for why am I not working on the measurement problem. And so I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, because I don't know the answer, and I don't think it's inconsistent for me to just put in the collapse postulate, to use it, and then if someone comes, so I had in my slides, there's a bunch of objections and replies that I've thought of over the years. All the standard objections I find don't grip me. So the standard objections to just adding the collapse postulate. So someone might say something like, well, look, you have to invoke consciousness, and of course that's bad because consciousness should be reduced to the physics. And I go, well, of course. What metaphysics are you bringing on board to say, of course, that can be reduced? So that's one sort of. Another thing someone might say is, well, that's vague. How do you know when to collapse? And I go, well, it's no problem for me. When I see something happen, I collapse the wave. I say the wave function is now collapsed. So I find all these things where I can just sort of defend myself against the claim of intellectual irresponsibility. Now, I'm not a metaphysician, and also I don't, at this stage in my career, pretend to have any sort of comprehensive view of how physics works even. So I'm just, in a way, sort of saying, this I think is the best I can do right now, the measurement problem. Do I think that some sort of dualist constructive solution invoking consciousness is the best solution? And actually, I'm inclined today, maybe my opinion will be a little bit different tomorrow, I'm inclined to actually think not. So based on sort of what I think Guido's question after my talk came to is, do you think this is so even if you believe that consciousness is an important feature of reality and that humans have mental states that are not reducible, is this the place to find it where collapses occur? And I think it doesn't really strike me as correct yet. That strikes me as probably not the place that the human mind plays the important role.
See what trouble you caused, gentlemen in the blue t-shirt there, confessions and everything. So, Sahab, you must have the last question.
Do we have time?
We just, do we have time? Yeah, we do. We have permission from the top, yeah.
My question is about so many work interpretation. I know that quantum mechanics seems to be a universal theory. But, as I understand, the theoretical core or mathematical core of quantum mechanics very much based on a phenomenological and experimental basis. For example, in the axiom of quantum mechanics, we have this concept that expectation value or probability is highly tied to the concept of infinite reputation on the measurements in the individual quantum system. That is, for me, it's very, I'm really eager to know that how is it possible to bring this quantum mechanic to the interpretation of the many worlds, which our system is from the nature is different. It's not a repeatable, measurable system. So how is it really possible? Because we have some axioms, we have some definitions that we are building up a theory, and then in the equal systems, then this definition doesn't exist.
Very succinct answer, because in your answer is the only thing between us and strong drink.
Well, I'll be very sure. A couple of things in that question. One is the infinite sequence accounted for ability, and I think that is a bit of a philosophical hangover, in fact. I think that's something that is still popular amongst physicists, but not for great reasons. And I think there are much better accounted for ability out there, even in the non-quantum context. So I think try and separate out these kind of infinite hypothetical sequences from probability. And you mentioned a couple of times the phrase the axioms of quantum mechanics. I'm not sure there really is any firmly agreed axiomatic basis, but I guess what you're referring to are essentially the rules used. What I would call, I think they've always called the quantum algorithm. So there's a procedure that you use if you're a physicist using quantum mechanics to make predictions. And that recipe is an operational procedure, and you can take several attitudes to that. You can either think that procedure is all there is to the theory, and the theory is just an operational theory. It's about how to make it. It's not really a theory at all. It's a recipe for making predictions. Or you can give some more explanatory account in the sense contrast to the principal account earlier, and try and say what the world is like, and give an account of what the world is like that will explain why using the algorithm, using what we're calling the axioms, works so well. So I think of what we have is an algorithm, a means of making predictions. What we want to explain is how the world could possibly be such as to make that algorithm work so well. And that is the hard problem that we still haven't fully solved.
The hard problem is a good phrase to end on. I guess we've left unresolved many hard problems. At last we have to wind things up, and I know William's going to say one or two comments, but I just want to say I've had the time of my life today. I'm incredibly grateful. And I want to thank some of the people who made it possible. Above all, William, who actually first, well, I guess is the person, the catalyst who brought all this together, but also drew my attention to it. Sarhaz has had a major role in putting things together. Many other people helped, and I suspect William will mention. I want to thank the speakers. I mean, it's been absolutely amazing. And those who've chaired the sessions. I guess you're going to thank our sponsors, super. But particularly I want to thank you lot, because I think we've had some really good Q&A as well, and it's just been fantastic. So particularly William, thank you for making me a happy old man. So thank you.
So just before we go for our wine and cheese, which I hope is waiting for us, I just want to mop up a few more of the acknowledgements. There's a lot of people that have been involved in this event. So, of course, I want to thank the University of St Andrews for hosting and for funding the speakers. Definitely SUPA, which is the Scottish University and Physics Alliance, for subsidising conference catering. I'd like to thank the committee consisting of Ryan Mullins, Sahar Saheb-Divans, Stephen Gamble, Paul Rimmer, Kaylee McCluskey for their help with parts of the preparation and their invaluable support on the day. I want to thank the chairman and the chairwomen, Raymond, Tallis, Andrew Vincent, again Sahar Saheb-Divan, Ryan Mullins and Simon Horsley. And finally, and I'm sure I've missed people, in which case I apologise, I'm very grateful to all of you, I want to thank our speakers, Hans Halvorson, Chris Hooley, Alastair Wilson, James Ladyman, and William Lane Craig. Please.